quoting from the book here, Pershing was not offended by the constructive criticism. In fact, he was impressed. And for Marshall's career, this turned out to be a pivotal encounter. His courage in speaking truth to power caused Pershing to confer even more power and authority on him. The general began to seek Marshall's advice, pulling him aside to discuss privately matters of training, strategy, and troop morale. On the sunny morning of June 26th, 1917, George Marshall set foot in France. The man who would later become the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army in World War II was tasked with helping to prepare the American Expeditionary Forces for battle on the Western Front in World War I, with the aim of helping the British and French forces break the stalemate of 4 years of bloody trench warfare and defeat the German army. Welcome to Construction Genius. My name is Eric Anderton, and today we are going to talk about courageous communication, speaking truth to power in a construction company. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. I'm going to read a quote here from the book George Marshall, Defender of the Republic, a recent biography by David L. Rohl. I'll link to it in the show notes. I encourage you to go out and get yourself a copy. And here's a quote from the book. Marshall's job was to set up sites for training, organize the construction of barracks and kitchens, and see that the raw, green soldiers of the American Expeditionary Forces were trained, equipped, and made ready for battle against an enemy that had been fighting for 3 years. You see, everyone in the Army was under incredible pressure, and one day, Major General John Pershing, the commander of the American forces, came to inspect the work of training and preparing the troops that Marshall was involved in. Pershing was not impressed and began dressing down the officers involved, including Marshall. So let's go back to the book here for a moment. As Pershing turned to leave, Marshall reached out and grasped his arm. General Pershing, there's something to be said here, and I think I should say it because I've been here longer. Pershing, taken aback, paused. Marshall's anger was bubbling to the surface. As one of his aides remembered, when Marshall was angry, his eyes flashed, and he talked so rapidly and vehemently, no one else could get in a word. For the next few minutes, Marshall crisply ticked off several reasons why the division's training progress had been inhibited, aiming much of the blame at Pershing's own headquarters staff. With impertinence, Marshall looked directly at Pershing and said, "We've worked very, very hard. The men have had no advantages, and they don't expect any, but they ought to get a fair deal at any rate." The encounter was over. Marshall's bosom friends believed his career was finished and he'd be fired right off. Just like it required courage for Marshall to speak up to General Pershing, so it requires courage for people down the chain of command in a construction company to speak up the chain to the leaders of the organization. But this kind of courage is essential if your construction company is going to be successful. So on today's episode, I'd like to speak about 3 specific things. The first one is the dangers of speaking truth to power. Next, we'll talk about the benefits of speaking truth to power. And then finally, we'll talk about how senior leaders can encourage speaking truth to power. And I know many senior leaders listen to this podcast, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on how you as a senior leader can really encourage your people to speak up. So for the purpose of the podcast, let's just spend a couple of minutes defining what I mean by courage. Courage is the state or quality of mind or spirit that enables someone to face danger, fear, or difficulties with self-possession, confidence, and resolution. I think one thing that we know as we grow is that courage is not really a feeling. In fact, courage may be contrary to our feelings. It is, in fact, a choice of the will. So keep that definition in mind as we go through today's episode. Let's take a look first at the dangers of speaking truth to power. Back to the story of Major Marshall at that time, speaking truth to Major General John Pershing. You've got to understand something. John Pershing was a full 4 ranks above the rank of Major Marshall at this time. So think about how your construction company is organized. If you're the CEO of your company, think of who sits 4 ranks below you. Perhaps it's a superintendent or a foreman or someone like that if you're taking a look at your company from yourself down into the field. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're a foreman or a superintendent or maybe even a project engineer, fresh out of college with one of those sweet degrees from many of the colleges in the area that are equipping people to be construction managers, think of someone who's 4 steps above you in the hierarchy. And think of the courage that's required in order to speak up to someone like that. So let's talk about those dangers. Well, the number one danger that many people experience when they're speaking truth to people who have power over them from a positional point of view is, what will they think of me? You know, what if I get fired? What if I get demoted? What if I'm ignored? What if I'm ridiculed? What if I get mocked for the things that I say? Those kinds of emotions go through our minds as we consider the consequences and the act of speaking truth to power. And all of these things can produce fear and an unwillingness to speak. So how should you handle this kind of fear? Well, the first thing is to expect it. Expect it. If you're a normal person and you consider speaking truth to someone who is above you in an organization, it's a very human emotion to experience some kind of fear or trepidation. And much of the podcast today is going to be talking about human emotions and the way that we feel, because a lot of times we're driven by our feelings. And in order to be courageous and in order to be effective as a leader and a contributor in your construction company, you have to learn to deal with those emotions and act courageously regardless of how you feel. So accept those feelings of fear and understand that they're going to be there and they're going to be present many times, particularly as you're getting practice speaking truth to power. So how can you immunize yourself from career paranoia? It's a very good question. Well, I want to encourage you. Most senior leaders have this mindset that good help is hard to find, particularly in the current environment, hiring environment that we're in construction, both in the field and the office. Good help is hard to find. So ask yourself a question. As you're going to speak truth to power, are you good help? Are you coming with the right intentions and the right mindset? Do you want to help the company, or do you just want to prove a point? Good help is hard to find, and if you're good help and if you're developing yourself, you're going to find a position in your organization. So I want to encourage you to be extremely self-reliant in your career. A phrase I often think of, it comes from sports, is that ballers ball. And what that means basically is this, is if you're good at what you do, you're going to find yourself a spot in an organization. And you should have confidence in yourself as you're developing your career that there is a place for you in an organization. And that kind of organization where you fit should be an organization where they're comfortable with people speaking truth to power. So live in such a way that you're developing yourself and you're finding confidence in your career advancement and you're being good help so that you can step up and speak without fear of being fired or demoted or ostracized, knowing that if those things do happen, you can always find work and employment in other places. Now, I'm speaking in somewhat of an extreme example because hopefully you work in an organization where that open flow of communication is allowed and the senior leadership has learned to set their egos aside. Because, you see, there's real benefits of speaking truth to power. And that's the second thing that we want to take a look at is the benefits of speaking truth to power. The benefit to the person who is doing the truth telling is they're able to live with themselves. One of the great struggles that many people have in their lives is they see things that are wrong, but for whatever reason, and often it's because of fear, they don't say something about those things. And one of the greatest things in life is to be able to live with a good conscience, knowing that you've had the conversations that you need to have and that you've spoken the truth despite how you feel. Not only is that a benefit, but think about the contribution that you have in your organization and the contribution that can be gained from people being willing to raise their hands and saying, hey guys, I think the way we're running this project is wrong, or the way that we're interacting with this client is wrong. We need to do things differently. Think about that benefit and how, as someone speaks truth to power, they can really contribute to the growth of the organization. And another benefit is when you do speak truth to power, good people will recognize that. Men and women of goodwill always appreciate people who are willing to tell the truth. And you see, if you don't tell the truth, what happens? Well, sometimes nothing happens, and the problem that you see goes away. But many times, the problem that you see gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I always think of the pain-time continuum. There's pain associated with any problem, but the longer we let time go by, typically, the more the pain associated with that problem increases. And that's why you have to get very good at speaking truth to power in your organization so that you can minimize the pain and the cost of the problems that your business is facing. And if you don't speak truth to power, then the problem can only get worse. So we've talked about the dangers of speaking truth to power. We've talked about the benefits of speaking truth to power. And now we're going to spend quite a bit of time speaking and looking at how senior leaders can encourage people to speak truth to power. In my house, we have semi-regular house meetings, and we try and do that just to make sure that we're communicating as a household. My wife and I, we have, a few kids, and sometimes things can get a little crazy running here and there, taking them to their various sports and schooling activities and all that kind of stuff. And so we like to have house meetings so that we're checking in on how everyone's doing and making sure that we're doing our best to communicate as a family. About a week ago, I was chatting with my kids, and I was saying, hey, listen, guys, if you have a problem with me, if I'm in some way, saying one thing but doing another, if I'm being a hypocrite, in other words, in any kind of way, feel free to come and talk to me about it. Of course, in a respectful way, but, come and talk to me about it. And it was really interesting because, a couple of my kids were kind of shaking their head. And then my 12-year-old, he spoke up and he said, it's kind of easy for you to say, Dad. And it was really interesting because I was genuine in what I was saying. I want my kids to come and talk to me in a respectful way if they think I need to see something that I'm missing. But from his perspective as a 12-year-old, it's an extremely difficult thing to come up to me as his father and speak truth to me. Now, your employees aren't your kids, but nevertheless, if you're in a place of senior leadership, there's a power dynamic there which at times can make it difficult for them to come and speak truth to you. So in order to encourage them to speak truth to power, first you have to understand something about your human nature as a leader. Number one, you like to be right. In fact, you're used to being right because you're in a place of leadership because generally speaking, hopefully, you get things right more often than you get them wrong. And not only do you like to be right, but you like to be confirmed in your rightness. You like people to say, hey, that's a good decision. I'm so glad we're going that way. And at times as a senior leader, because you like to be right and you like to be confirmed, you want to avoid conflict and contradiction. And that can be a real challenge. It's really easy in companies to get to the place where everyone is not necessarily airing their points of view, but they just kind of push them aside and everyone gets through the meeting as quickly as possible and you just go on about your day. And you as a leader, you might think, well, I've done my job trying to solicit input from people, and so therefore I'm okay with the decision that we're making. But perhaps they didn't give you the input because they understand that really you're not that good at receiving input that is contrary to the way you're thinking about a situation. So you have to understand your human nature. You also have to realize how you come across to others. You know, as you wake up in the morning most of the time, you're not looking at yourself as a senior leader saying, I'm a big, bad senior leader, and I'm so competent, and I'm so ready to go. But the way you're perceived by other people is different. You know, you think about, again, how a child perceives his parent or her parent as this sort of wonder person, you know, and by the time they get to being a teenager, maybe the shine is off the apple a little bit and they see some of the flaws of the parent. But nevertheless, you have a particular impact upon people. And sometimes you're not conscious of the depth of that impact. For instance, a lot of the construction leaders that I work with, I do an assessment with them. It's called the Profile XT. It's an excellent assessment. And by the way, if you're ever interested in taking an assessment that can really give you some insights into the way that you think and the way you behave, just reach out to me and I can send you the assessment. It's very interesting. But one of the things it measures is the energy level and the assertiveness of the leaders. And if you have a high energy level and a high degree of assertiveness, people who perhaps aren't running as fast as you and stepping into leadership roles as readily as you, they may look at you and be frankly intimidated. And you're just acting normally, but they're intimidated by the way that you're showing up. And you have to understand that and be willing to modulate your behavior for the benefit of others so that you can be someone who is approachable and able to be spoken to about the issues and the challenges that you're finding in your organization. Now, that doesn't mean that you completely, lay aside your personality and the way that you show up. But I just want to underscore that you should be aware of the way that you behave and how it affects other people. And by the way, that's another reason why if you do assessments in your organization, everyone in the organization involved in a leadership role should take them so that you develop a common language and vocabulary around the things that the assessment measures. And then you should be sharing your assessments with one another to help facilitate communication. And you also have to understand the nature of most people. Most of the time, people are looking at you and they're doing a cost-benefit analysis. And this is the question that they're asking. Hopefully, you've hired smart people, so they see the issues in the organization, and they're asking themselves, is it worth me speaking truth to power? And so they're observing. Perhaps they're looking the last time someone spoke truth to power. And if you kind of smacked them down, whether consciously or unconsciously, they're going to take that data, they're going to process it, and the next time an issue comes up where perhaps they might have a disagreement, they may think, you know what? I don't think it's worth it to speak truth to power in this particular situation because the last time it happened, that person got spoken to in a way that wasn't helpful, right? So they may stick their neck out once or twice, let's say, but if they continually get smacked down, then maybe they won't stick their neck out anymore. So understand the nature of most people. They're always doing that cost-benefit analysis in terms of, is it worth it to speak truth to power? And really then what you need to do is accept your power, your authority that you have as a gift, and don't abuse it. Don't walk on eggshells around your folks, but understand, like I said, you have an impact on other people, and sometimes that impact is far beyond what you appreciate or think about. So one way that you can apply this is be willing to speak softly most of the time and invite other people to participate and invite their points of view. And also take specific opportunities when appropriate to say, you know what, I was wrong, or I've changed my mind. And do your best to not be like someone who surrounds yourself with flatterers. You know, like when the emperor has no clothes on and everyone around him is saying, Emperor, your outfit is really, really magnificent. You don't want to be an emperor without any clothes on, walking around all naked, right? So surround yourself, do your best to surround yourself with people who will not only support you in your leadership role, but will be willing to tell you the truth. So those are the three things that we've looked at here today. The first thing was the dangers of speaking truth to power. The second was the benefits of speaking truth to power. And thirdly, how senior leaders can encourage speaking truth to power. Now, you may be someone who reports to a senior leader, and you may have an issue or a challenge that you need to speak to them about. And you might be saying to yourself, well, who am I to say these things? I mean, particularly, let's say you're a project engineer or, you know, a foreman or a superintendent, and you look up the chain at these executives and they're driving their fancy trucks and they're, you know, going to fancy restaurants and all this kind of stuff, and maybe they have years more experience, and who are you to say something to them? And that's a good question. And the answer I would have to that is, who are you? Really, you're nobody. All of us in our lives, we have issues and we have challenges. You know, there's an old saying that before you can take the speck out of somebody's eye, the piece of dust out of somebody's eye, you've got to be willing to take the log out of your own eye. In other words, before you can help other people deal with their issues, you've got to make sure that you've dealt with the issues in your life. And so get into that habit. Assume that you've got issues, that you've got logs in your eye, that you're not doing everything perfectly either. And when you have that assumption, it'll help you from coming into a confrontation or a speaking truth to power opportunity without a bunch of cockiness. So first, take the log out of your own eye. And once you've taken the log out of your own eye, you're going to see clearly to help to take the piece of dust out of the person's eye that you're talking to. So admit your own hypocrisies or your own failings, deal with them, and then speak anyway. Because it's absolutely essential for the health of an organization that there are people up and down the chain of command who are willing to speak truth to power. Now, it's interesting. I want to go back to the book on George Marshall and talk about the reaction that General Pershing had when this Major Marshall grabbed him by the sleeve and started talking truth to power. Quoting from the book here, Pershing was not offended by the constructive criticism. In fact, he was impressed. And for Marshall's career, this turned out to be a pivotal encounter. His courage in speaking truth to power caused Pershing to confer even more power and authority on him. The general began to seek Marshall's advice, pulling him aside to discuss privately matters of training, strategy, and troop morale. In early January 1918, Marshall was promoted to lieutenant colonel. And throughout the winter and into the spring, private sessions between the two became more frequent and their relationship deepened. Marshall had encountered no other superior officer with whom he could be frank to the degree he could with General Pershing. And it's notable about General Pershing that he was the type of person who not only was able to hear people below him speaking truth to power and receive that constructive criticism, he went on to become a mentor to many in the generation of generals who led the United States Army during World War II, including folks like George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, and Douglas MacArthur. All very strong, excellent leaders who were brought up under the leadership of General Pershing, and much of that mentoring ability was because General Pershing was known as a person who would receive constructive criticism. So let's talk about some next steps, specifically about how to speak up the chain of command. So let's say you're a superintendent or a foreman or a project engineer or a project manager, and you see an issue and you want to bring it up to the executive level. Consider your timing. When should you do it? When you see something, it isn't immediate that you should necessarily say something. I encourage you to look for patterns of behavior, not just one single incident. And definitely, as far as the timing is concerned, don't bring something up when you're heated. Because you may be correct, but if you present your issue when you're mad or when you're over-emotional or perhaps even when you're out of control, you may be correct, but you're going to lose credibility. Another thing to keep in mind as far as the timing is when the other person is distracted. One of the things that people often do, the mistakes they make, is they walk in the door of a leader and they come up with a big issue when the leader is focused on something else. And the leader, even though he may want to hear what you have to say, is not able to hear you because they're focused on something else. So make sure that you don't come up with an issue when the person is focused or distracted on something else. And also, and this is fundamental, by the way, make sure that if you're going to speak up the chain of command, that you are prepared. Those are the two ways you're going to lose credibility, is if you're mad or if you're not prepared. And that's one of the keys. Know your audience. When Marshall was talking to Pershing, he wasn't just, venting to him, but a torrent of facts came with his constructive criticism. I'll quote from the book here. The promised platoon manuals that never arrived and had set back training. The inadequate supplies that left men walking around with gunny sacks on their feet instead of boots. The inadequate quarters that left troops scattered throughout the countryside, sleeping in barns. The lack of motor transport that forced troops to walk. In other words, he had facts to back up his reaction to the general's criticism. And I want to encourage you, if you're going to get credibility with folks, make sure you've got your facts straight. Senior level people are often driven by numbers, not just emotions. And if you can come with numbers to back up the things that you're seeing on the ground in the construction project that you're working on, it's really going to boost your credibility. And that's a fundamental thing for you to do. So, and I just want to say one other thing here. Do your best to adapt to the point of view and the language of the people that you're talking to up the chain of command. And this takes time and it takes experience and it takes some thought. But understand that the point of view of the executive team isn't necessarily your point of view. Specifically, if you're working on one project and your project is experiencing issues and you go up the chain of command with that project challenge, the people that you're speaking to in the executive level many times are facing other issues, and your project may not be getting top priority for very good reasons. So assume the best about the executive leadership in your organization, and perhaps that'll help you in the way that you present the challenge that you're faced with. And do your best, like I said, to adopt the language of the executive team. So if you have to kind of brush off the construction site language and prepare for a more formal presentation, maybe you need to go to someone else in the organization to help you with that formal presentation. But whatever the case is, make sure that you are prepared as far as speaking truth to power. My name is Eric Anderton. I really appreciate you listening to this episode of Construction Genius, Courageous Communication, Speaking Truth to Power in a Construction Company. And I would appreciate it if you would give us a review and a rating of the podcast wherever you get your shows. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or at my website, ericanderton.com. And like I mentioned earlier, I do have an assessment that I use with many construction companies, helping them to understand themselves. It's called a Profile XT assessment. If you're interested in taking that assessment and getting more information about how that can help you get insight on yourself and on your team, again, feel free to reach out to me on my website, ericanderton.com. Go to the Contact Me page. I'll get back to you within 24 hours. Thanks again for listening to the program here today. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Construction Genius. Thank you for listening to this episode of Construction Genius. Hope you found that 1% of inspiration to help you in the next few days. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star review on iTunes, share it with other construction leaders who you think would benefit, and always remember that the show is brought to you by Kick-Ass Meetings. I've been working with construction leaders since 2004, teaching them how to run extremely effective problem-solving meetings that gets their people collaborating, taps into their creativity, and to get yourself a free copy of the Kick-Ass Meeting Report, go to www.ericanderton.com/kickassmeetings. Grab yourself that free report, read it, use it in your business. You'll find it extremely useful. And thanks again for listening.